Welcome. I'm Michael Bickert. Thanks for joining me today as we explore concepts with the objective of improving your management skills and growing your business. I want to remind you at the beginning of the video here to grab a notepad, grab that pen, because I want you to make a commitment to yourself that you will jot down some notes, you will jot down some sort of action item that you can implement in your business today, because that's what this is all about, driving your business forward each and every day. Now today I want to talk to you about a phenomenon that I have observed in management. And it's sort of hard to pinpoint. When I was contemplating this, and as I've seen this over the years, I can describe it in detail, and I'll do that for you, but it's really hard to summarize in one fell swoop in just a few words. So it's characterized by two primary things that I observe in managers. I've observed this in myself throughout the years. I've observed it in just about all managers, and I would advise against it. So it's characterized by two main things. The first one is the largely indiscriminate implementation of new ideas. And the second one is the deployment and expenditure of resources that are most readily available and at your fingertips and familiar to you. Now, both of those things independently, those don't sound too bad, and even, combined, it doesn't sound too bad. So I want to describe those in a little greater detail and show you how doing these things can be really detrimental to your effectiveness as a manager and your organization. So that first one we talked about was the largely indiscriminate implementation of new ideas. What can be wrong with implementing new ideas? Also, the deployment and expenditure of resources that are readily at your fingertips and there for you to invest. I mean, Michael, you always say that you need to leverage your resources for the greatest return on investment. So what's wrong with that? The problem is, I think I would describe both of these things as reactive management. And we know primarily from Stephen Covey was most vocal and most popularized the notion that proactivity is what leads to effectiveness. It's one of the 7 habits of highly effective people. So to the degree that you want to be an effective manager, you don't want to be reactive. Reactive management is something to avoid. And in both of these cases, it's reactive. Perhaps you know someone who's a great idea generator. I describe myself as that. I'm always thinking of new ideas. Do you know someone who always has 100 new ideas? Perhaps they have 1,000 projects on the go at any given time, and they have a million excuses for why none of these seem to come to fruition, or a great majority of them fall short of what their original vision was. The thing is, you have to be very deliberate in your execution and your organization and your strategizing and your implementation of new ideas. You have to take the time to figure out where these ideas fit into your overall game plan. Now, there's nothing wrong with that idea generation. In fact, that's a huge asset to your organization, to your company. You want to have someone, if it's not you, you want to have as many people, that the whole idea generation decentralized as possible. You want to have lots of good ideas, but you don't want to indiscriminately start implementing them chronologically as you come up with them. Instead, you need to put them in what we call the parking lot. You need to put them aside, and then you have to evaluate them and carefully, use that concept of the idea implementation grid, where you plot things based on practicality of implementation and also based on how much benefit you're likely to derive from it, what the return on the investment will be. And then what you can do is you can chronologically work those into your plan. And you should always be working on those two things which are most important to the success of your business. Those two most important things are where you want to focus your attention. And the problem with these people who are great idea generators, when they indiscriminately start implementing them, is they kind of make it just is a big distraction. All hands on deck. The boss has this great new idea, or somebody of influence in the organization has a great new idea, and we're going to start working on that. And you can just imagine the people rolling their eyes. Here's the latest. And you got to be really careful with that. But it's a great thing to generate those ideas. So put them in a parking lot, make sure that you spend some time, schedule some time to figure out where they fall in your master plan, and then work them into that plan. And then you will start to, check these things off as you go through. They will work their way up to the number 1 or number 2 thing on your list, and you can work on these things. And you can schedule some time to work on some of these ideas, especially those ones which are really, really practical and don't take a lot of resources to implement. You can do those from time to time when you're not at your peak and you're not able to be working on the most important things because maybe you're burnt out a little bit or whatever, and you just want a victory. And so you can go to the parking lot and try to get a win or 2 in the books. But the key is you don't want to just be willy-nilly, always on to the latest epiphany. And the key is you don't want to stifle your enthusiasm or your people's enthusiasm as they come up with these ideas. You want this culture of idea generation, but you also, along with that, you instill a culture of we're going to be very deliberate in our implementation. We're going to strategize, and we're going to put things chronologically in order of importance. Spontaneity has its place in your business, and there are some assets associated with spontaneity, but you got to be careful that spontaneous opportunities don't serve as a distraction, taking you away and displacing your greatest efforts and your resources from where they should be deployed and where they will maximize the return on investment. It's that whole thing like, oh, look, a squirrel. You get distracted very easily. You were working on something, making progress, and then boom, you had this epiphany. You had this great idea, or someone did, and you're like, hey, that's really good. And you get distracted. And the symptoms of this are what I described before. These people. They've got so many plates spinning, so many projects on the go, and it's like, could you just finish one thing before we move on to the next thing? And depending on the scope of work involved to implement a project, it's okay to work on multiple things, but you don't want to multitask and be doing things at the same time. That's absolutely ineffective. It doesn't work, and it will lead away from success. Your actual idea generation can become a liability for your organization as opposed to an asset. And then this other one we talked about was this deployment of an expenditure of your resources based on your ability to access them, based on your familiarity with them, based on they're there at your fingertips. There's that expression, to a hammer, all the world looks as if it's a nail, or something along those lines. And this is maybe hard to pick up in your organization. You really have to look for this. So have you ever been sitting there and you open a package with a fork, for example? Or you use your mouth as a third hand? Maybe someone who has a treadmill that is acting as a clothes hanger. And in everyday life, these things are normal, and you may refer to these as resourcefulness. And you think of, we know that resourcefulness is really key component and is a great asset to an organization. But really in business, you got to be careful, and you want to be, again, more deliberate and carefully assess the deployment and expenditure of resources as most makes sense for your organization at that time. And so I'll give you some examples where I've seen before that people deploy or expend resources without really giving thought to, is this the best way we can do it? So you need something done. Think of something that needs to be done in your organization, and somebody walks by and you say, oh, hey, so-and-so, can I get you to run down to wherever and pick up this? And, so there's just a really quick example of getting somebody, your talent pool, your human resources, to execute a task without being more deliberate, without stopping to assess and think. And I understand, business happens fast, and day to day, you can't be stopping all production to think through everything entirely, but you do want to develop habits where you start to think about how you're going to deploy this, so that when you're on the go, when you're really moving and shaking, you can reference those sort of rules, those heuristics and foundational principles of management that you rely on all the time. So that's one way that you can really shorten the reaction time. So we talk about reactiveness is not a good idea, and I think in no small part because you make poor decisions when you don't have a lot of time. So if something happens and you just react to it right away, that's not nearly as well thought out as if you had considered the possibility of something happening and you thought to yourself, if this occurs, here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna have an action plan for it. And so start to think of these things and then have these little rules, these axioms that you follow each and every time. So in my example, if you need something picked up, I don't know, at the warehouse or whatever right away, you have a default position. And so when it springs up on the moment, you're like, oh boy, we're out of this thing. We need someone to send to the warehouse. You think about, in that case, we are going to deploy the resource that we have that makes the most sense. We're not going to send the manager, or the manager himself is not going to run out and get it because his time is worth so much more. We should have him focused on the most important thing. Who is the lowest paid resource? What is the lowest paid way to do this? Should we have a courier go pick that up and deliver it? How much would that cost, as opposed to having somebody who's part of our production system away from the system and slowing things down? That's just one example. So in terms of HR, avoid displacing optimum productivity by delegating tasks to those people that could be doing something more productive elsewhere. That is to say, that's what you want to avoid. So think of those times, start to discuss this as a team, and have people, give people the permission to speak up and give you ideas when you're delegating, not to just sort of say, salute, yes boss, I'll go and do that, but maybe you give your people permission to push back and say, hey, would it be okay if I found another way to do that that is more productive, so I could spend my time more productively? Another maybe more counterintuitive example is keeping somebody employed who is not very productive. You're getting very poor return on the investment. This is very common, but it's the same sort of thing. I'm deploying a resource that I have because it's familiar, because it's there, it's at my fingertips. I have access to it, so I will deploy it. But of course, we want to leverage our resources to the maximum to ensure the maximum return on investment. And if you have somebody in your organization who is proven to be a poor return on investment, so don't be reactive and just say, well, I've got him, so I will use him. I know that sounds compassionate. We've got other videos where we discuss this. It's not the right thing to do. Instead, you owe it to yourself, to your business, and the stakeholders who rely on you to then find someone who could be more productive. So those are just a couple of HR examples of this. Of course, another invaluable resource is your time, and some examples are where you become ineffective and mediocre by multitasking because you have things that are before you, they're present, they're in front of you, so you start working on them instead of being deliberate with your time. Or you're working on projects that are further down the list that should be things that are put off. Another example of deployment of resources, that this example being the resource of time, again, without being very deliberate, without carefully assessing, is this the best use of this resource at this time? Of course, in business, the resource that we think of the most is our financial resources, our operating capital. And I have observed where we have this poor management habit of squeaky wheel getting the grease. You've heard this before, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And usually that has to do with someone who is complaining the loudest, somebody who has got the boss's attention or has got the decision maker's attention, and they're speaking the loudest, and therefore they get the resource, they get the attention. And this is a mistake as well. Instead, you want to consider, so you're about to expend some resources, you're going to deploy some capital to fix a problem or to pursue an opportunity. Have you given consideration to the competing things that are out there? Some people who may be more quiet, maybe you want to go to other departments and say, I'm considering doing the following. We're going to invest over here to pursue this opportunity. Maybe there's some equipment, maybe we're going to hire somebody new, maybe you're going to employ some technology or outsource something. And by getting feedback from everyone and decentralizing the decision making, showing the respect to other stakeholders, you may have some opportunities that you go, oh, actually there's a better way that we can deploy this capital, that we can use this money, put it to work for us. That doesn't mean that the first opportunity is never going to be realized or even pursued. What it means is you are going to be very careful in assessing what are the greatest opportunities to deploy your capital and other resources. All in all, this involves slowing down and thinking about things, carefully planning. That's what you are supposed to do as a manager. And a really important thing to remember is good managers know how and when to say no. You've got to say no to certain opportunities. You've got to say no to certain ideas. You've got to say no to using your time expending any resource in certain ways that don't make the most sense at the best time. Remember, management is about the organization and I guess exercising deployment of all of your resources on a moment-to-moment basis as is best needed, as it requires the attention the most for the business to maximize the opportunities in the business at that exact time. So once again, I just want to get you to think about this idea of not being a reactive manager. And you think, well, I know you're supposed to be proactive, but how can I be proactive? It's about spending some time learning about the concepts now so that you'll identify these as symptoms when they come up. And also spend some time considering all the various things that come up in a business. And I don't mean every little example, but you think of these things as analogies for, one example can cover 1,000 different of the same sort of, they're analogous to 1,000 other things that are very similar in nature. And you refer in your Rolodex of experience and your axioms and heuristics in management, your principles, you go back to them and you say, this is how we're gonna act in this situation. That's how you can reduce that reaction time where it's much more proactive. The proactivity was taking the time to plan, discuss with the group. And it's okay to be reactive from time to time. Well, we have to be reactive, but now let's learn from our experience. That's the other thing here. You might not brainstorm everything at one time, but when something goes off the rails a little bit, when you realize, boy, how did I get so many projects on the go? How did we end up deploying that resource over here and we made that brutal mistake? You stop and think about it, and now you discuss it as a team, and you say, well, what is our standard operating procedure going to be in these cases going forward? And you can reference that experience as a manager. So much of what's going to make you effective is experience. So learn from the mistakes. Business is filled with mistakes. Don't get frustrated by them. Go, oh, well, here's a great educational opportunity. Frame those mistakes and those setbacks through the lens of educating yourself and becoming more experienced and becoming more effective, and be more proactive and avoid reactive management. I don't know if this really resonates with you or if you've witnessed this in yourself or others in your organization. I can tell you that, if you really take the time to observe, you will see this time and again. So I hope you got something out of this. That's where I want to leave it today. But I'm interested, and I'm always curious to hear from you whether or not you've experienced this and how do you deal with it. Leave some sort of comment that we can all learn from, because we need to learn from one another. Perpetual refinement.